Secretary Ochoa talked about the complexity of the higher education, and actually I was about to fall into the trap. I was about to use the word system. We don't have a higher education system. That's one of the really challenging things about our country. It's been a historical advantage of higher education in the United States is that it's this aligned. There's a whole bunch of institutions. It's kind of this affiliated and unaffiliated group of institutions that do roughly the same thing, but they accept it at the state level. There's some sort of coordination and common movement, but we've got somewhere between 4 to 5,500 institutions that all operate without sort of top-down governance oversight, and as a result, moving this non-system in a direction is like pushing spaghetti or whatever the phrase is. It's difficult, and so one of the interesting things about this moment is that we have what I'd argue is probably the closest thing to a national higher education strategy that we've had in half a century through it's certainly not a coincidental alignment, but an alignment of foundations and other sort of agitators out there, sort of good agitators in terms of prodding things along, and with the imprimatur of the federal government when the new administration came in, this sort of college completion agenda. And there was an interesting question asked in the last panel for those of you who were here about whether the completion agenda might have some unintended consequences. I mean, the question in the earlier panel was about the push for standards and whether you potentially get more graduates but with less quality. And I guess I'd throw it out to this panel whether you see any similar dangers or at least potential risk from the higher education completion agenda. I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I would say, so one of the other articles in the College Guide is about, it's called College Dropout Factories. It uses as an example, but it also makes the point that this college is only one of many such colleges. Chicago State University, who for every year for the last, I think, 8 or 9 years, their 6-year graduation rate has varied, very consistent, between 10 and 15%. Never less than 10, never more than 15. And in fact, if you kind of look through history, I mean, it's an institution that has been kind of cycling through a kind of a familiar pattern of scandal and short-lived reform since the early 1970s. And yet, no one seems to know about this. No one seems to pay attention. You can find colleges with, graduation rates that are far closer to 0 than any other number that one might kind of compare them to in most of the big cities in this country. And in most of those places, there have been very, very high-profile reform efforts. We heard about some of them this morning to try to address the scandal of high schools that only graduate half their students, where in many of those same cities, there are universities that, if they were able to graduate half their students, would be much, much better than they are today, and yet not a fraction of the attention. I mean, here in Washington, D.C., the mayoral election and the possible transition of our very well-known schools chancellor has been national news. It's been covered all over the country. We also have one public university here in Washington, D.C., the University of District of Columbia, which is unfortunately on that list of dropout factories, has been, I should say, in fairness to UDC, has been doing a lot in the last couple of years to try to improve itself. But it, too, has been sort of languishing for a long, long time in dysfunction, and nobody has paid any attention. I don't think anybody outside of, I think most people that don't live here don't even know there is a University of District of Columbia, much less that it's troubled, much less cares one way or the other. And I think, one thing that sort of strikes me is that these graduation rates have been public for a long time. The information is out there, and the same is true. And so I don't think we can only rely on consumer information. I'm a big advocate of more consumer information. But the Department of Education isn't proposing simply to create these measures and publish them. It's proposing to create these measures and regulate with them. And so I think we need a balance in the completion agenda between informing students about the colleges and their likelihood of success. But for colleges, and there are many of them, I mean, this is not a matter of one or two, it's a matter of, I think, probably a few hundred, that really are just failing on a year-by-year basis to make any progress in helping an appreciable number of their students graduate. We need a stronger regulatory response, and I think it needs to be a partnership, quite frankly, between the federal government and state governments to do it.
Yes, I agree with what you're saying, absolutely. But I just want to add a note of caution, lest one think that this is such a no-brainer. Graduation rates are computed based on, and the denominator of the ratio is the full-time entering freshman class. And you know, and again, I'm not trying to defend Chicago State in particular, because there are institutions that have the same profile that do far better. But you know, just to give you an example, the institution that I came with that has a decent record, half of our graduating class are students who didn't start with us. So they're not captured in the graduation rate. They came from somewhere else and they end up graduating in our school. So the graduation rate only gives you one little glimpse. It shows how many of the students that initially started with you full-time actually stick with your institution all the way through graduation. But it doesn't, what doesn't describe is, for example, if when students left, did they actually drop out or did they transfer to another school? How many students transferred in? How many of those graduated? So it is a little more complex picture than that. And, but I'm not to excuse the low performers, but just to keep that in mind.